Well, welcome. I'm Dan Smith, the director of the Political Economy Research Institute here at Middle Tennessee State University. And the Political Economy Research Institute is a privately funded student-centered initiative with a mission of engaging undergraduate and graduate students with faculty in both teaching and research that will further our understanding of the market economy, and especially its impact on the well-being of society. We certainly appreciate you joining us for tonight's event. Please make sure to follow us on Facebook and Twitter for future programming notices. Tonight, I'm absolutely thrilled to introduce Dr. Jason Brennan. Jason is the Robert J. and Elizabeth Flanagan Family Professor of Strategy, Economics, Ethics, and Public Policy at the McDonough School of Business at Georgetown University. You have to really work on breathing when you're introducing Jason Brennan. He specializes in politics, philosophy, and economics. He currently has 7 books under contract with Oxford University Press and Routledge Press, and he is the author of 13 books, including some of my favorites, Why Not Capitalism, The Ethics of Voting, When All Else Fails, Resistance, Violence, and State Injustice, and the co-authored Cracks in the Ivory Tower, The Moral Mess of Higher Education, and Injustice for All, How Financial Incentives Corrupted and Can Fix the US Criminal Justice System, which of course, if I had the power to see the future 6 months ago when we planned this, would have certainly been the topic for today, given the significance of today's events. But we definitely have videos of past events of criminal justice and police reform, including Howard Henderson, Radley Balco, and Zuri Davis. But I highly recommend Jason's co-authored book, Injustice for All, if you're interested in the topic, and you should be. But tonight we have Jason speaking on his recently published book with Routledge, Why It's Okay to Want to Be Rich. This lecture is made possible by the generous support of Tom and Martha Collins as part of our M. Thomas and Martha Collins Free Enterprise lecture series. Thank you for advancing scholarly discourse on free enterprise among college students, and especially the broader community, with your generosity. You can view a past lecture in the series from Bert Folsom on his book, Uncle Sam Can't Count, on our webpage. Finally, I want to thank our staff at the PERI, Brian Delaney, our communications and editor, and Henry Bailey, our executive aide, who deserve all the credit for organizing this event and handling all the behind the scenes work. We will take written questions via the Q&A Zoom tool at the end of the lecture, which is in the bottom middle of your screen if you have the same Zoom version as me. But without further ado, Professor Brennan, we're excited to welcome you and to hear what you have to say.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm going to share some PowerPoint slides right now. And one second to that. Sorry that I'm not here in person with you. If you'd like to share a video, I think you have to do that on your end. Actually, it turns out I can't just click the button. Though this might actually be better without my face. I have a face for radio, not for TV. So let me tell you what this book is about. It's really part of a series called Why It's Okay. And what Routledge is going for here with all the authors of these books is looking at the fact that intellectuals, people working the academy, people like, who write books for a living and think for a living, have a tendency to kind of disparage day-to-day thinking and like the kind of way that normal people live. It's very common to point our fingers at how people live and say that it's wrong. And what they wanted in this series was an intellectual defense of the kinds of attitudes and behaviors that are actually very common, that the average person actually lives under, rather than just simply turning a critical eye to day-to-day normal moral life. And so that's part of what inspired me to write this book about the desire to be rich. Because when I think about what Americans are like and how they think, I think it's fair to say that in general, we have as a nation, as a culture, a split personality about money. On one hand, most of us want to be rich, but we feel kind of bad about having that desire. We have a strong tendency to show off our material wealth and to try to display when we've made it. But at the same time, we also feel like annoyed when other people do it. We are very fascinated by the lives of the rich, and we often admire certain rich people like Mark Cuban or Oprah Winfrey or other rich celebrities. But at the same time, we also like denigrate rich people and tend to think that they're amoral and vicious people. We love rags to riches stories, but we also love stories about the rich being torn down. We love stories about peasants leading a peasant lifestyle and being happy in it. And we clap when we watch the old movie Wall Street, when Gordon Gekko argues that greed is good, everybody claps. And then when they haul that greedy bastard off to jail at the end of the movie, everyone claps at that too. So we really do have this sort of split personality. We like money, but we feel bad about it. We think money is the root of all evil, and yet we want more of it. So what I want to do in this book is really defend money against 3 principal charges. three finger-wagging ideas that you hear from a wide range of moralists throughout human history, a wide range of people who have argued that money is bad for one reason or another. So one claim that people make is that it's wrong to want money. If you want money, you should feel kind of bad about having that desire. You should be satisfied with what you have. Money supposedly distracts us from what's really good in life. It distracts us from higher values. Desiring money, desiring material goods is desiring the wrong thing. Beyond that, you frequently hear people claim that it's wrong to make money, that making money is sort of a shameful act. If you work in business, that's kind of a shameful activity. And really the only thing that will kind of, in some ways, relieve you of your sins is if you give away enough of that money at the end. But we often, especially like a lot of you are in business schools, I work in a business school, you often have this language as if what it is to be a business person is to take, and hurt. And maybe if you give enough of it away back at the end, maybe you'll make up for it. But the business itself is a bad activity. Money making is seen as wrong. And that relates finally to that last bit where people tend to think that when you've made money, you should give most of it away. It's shameful to hold on to it. It's shameful to live high when other people die. I don't want to say that these ideas are completely wrong. There definitely are people who the desire for money corrupts and harms their lives. There definitely are people who the pursuit of material goods is vicious and it is interfering with them. There are people that make money the wrong way and in harmful ways. And you should be giving to charity, especially when you have more money. I think all of those things are true, but they're overstated. And so what I want to do in this book is argue for the opposite conclusions, fundamentally. It's okay to want money. Indeed, you should want money. Money is worth wanting. When you understand what money does for you, you realize it actually deserves your desire. It's something you should want more of. It's okay further to make money. And indeed, if you're making money the right way, if you're operating the proper way as a business person, that you're already going to be giving back to society in virtue of the way that you make money. Indeed, a lot more than you're giving back a lot more by being a proper business person than you will through almost any activity you engage in, more than you will as a voter, more than you will as someone who donates money later. And finally, it's okay to keep money. Yeah, I will argue and I agree that the common sense idea that charity is a good thing is correct. You should be beneficent, and the richer you are, the easier it is for you to give to others, the stronger the duty is to give. But nevertheless, you're not falling into some sort of perpetual debt to society that can never be eradicated. You're not obligated to give it all away. So those are the three claims of the book. And we'll go through some of it. The book's pretty long. We won't go through all of it, but I'll give you like some of the basic reasons to believe all of these things. So here's why this might matter. One reason why it might matter is just because, I think it's interesting. I think it's interesting when you see that people have paradoxical beliefs or inconsistent beliefs. And probably almost anyone listening, in fact, has inconsistent beliefs. It's just part of the human condition. We're not able to sort of think about all the things we believe all at the same time. So we often don't notice that the contradictions in our beliefs. And when we do notice them, it's uncomfortable. And so, one thing the philosophers do is they notice that discomfort and try to fix it. And some people just try to not think about it anymore. So that's one reason why it matters. But it matters for other reasons too, not just for intellectual reasons, not just because, the truth matters for the sake of being the truth. One reason it matters is because when we talk about like what the rich owe, or whether it's okay to be rich, or whether it's okay to want money, we're not talking just about Mark Cuban and Oprah Winfrey or Jeff Bezos. We're talking about you. You, the people listening to this, are the rich. I remember I was teaching a class. My first job right out of college was at this posh Ivy League school where the median household income for the incoming first year class that year was $260,000. That was back in 2006, so it'd be higher now if we adjusted for inflation and so on. And I remember teaching a class on some of this stuff, and some students said, "Soak the rich, man." And I'm like, "You're the rich. You're the person that is being talked about here." But that's not just true about brown students. That's true of almost every American. The fact is, like, if you are at the poverty line in the United States, the United States defines the poverty line for a single adult living alone as about $12,700. Now, adjusting for the cost of living and the fact that it's often cheaper to live in other countries than here, even after you adjust for the cost of living, if you're at the poverty line in the United States, you are in something like the top 15 to 18% of income earners worldwide. You're also in the top 1% of people ever to have lived when it comes to how wealthy you are. all it takes to be in the global 1%, when people complain about the 1%, what it takes to be in the global 1% is really only about $40,000 a year. So most Americans are in that kind of category. They're in the top 1%. They are the rich. So there's the ultra rich, but there's also the rich. We are people who are living much better than the people who came before us. Even if you think about, say, the year 1900, the average American living today is roughly about 5 times richer than the average American living 100 years ago. We are the rich. So if being rich is bad, if living high while other people die is bad, if wanting money is bad, then it turns out that all of us are really bad people. So it's interesting to know whether that's true. But it matters also because of how you're going to live your life. If you come to have the view that what it is to make a positive difference in the world is to go work for a charity, and that's the only way you can count as doing something good, or the only way you can count as doing something good is to work in politics, then you're going to forego all sorts of opportunity to really help people and to really make a positive difference. I teach an entire class on something called effective altruism, what charity works and what doesn't. And I can tell you the average charity, again, I think you should give to charity, but the average charity is not doing much good. Most of you will be doing a lot more good for the world by whatever you do as a business person or in your career than you will be doing through charity. So finally, it also is about guilt. Having false beliefs about morality, about the morality of money, can make you feel guilty. It can make you lead your life badly. It can make you spend your time doing things that sound good rather than things that actually are good. So I think all of this really does matter. It's not just some purely academic exercise for philosophers and political scientists. So with that, let's start defending the cash. Let's talk about wanting money. Once upon a time, there was this really rich person, the son of a really rich dad named Robert Kennedy. And Robert Kennedy almost became president. Why did he almost become president? Because he had the right last name. He was very good looking. He spoke well. He was connected to the right people. Maybe even he had some good ideas too. He was famous for giving a speech about gross domestic product, the way that we measure the amount of production in a different country. He says, the gross national product does not allow for the health of our children, the quality of their education, or the joy of their play. It does not include the beauty of our poetry, the strength of our marriages, the intelligence of our public debate, or the integrity of our public officials, which is a good line for Kennedy's because they were rather corrupt people. It measures neither our wit nor our courage, neither our wisdom nor our learning, neither our compassion nor our devotion to our country. It measures everything, in short, except that which makes life worthwhile. Well, that sounds like an incredibly damning indictment of GDP. For what it's worth, it's not actually original to Kennedy to say these things. The very person who came up with the concept of GDP, his name's Kuznets, said all these things first. He wasn't running for president and wasn't using it to get power, but nevertheless, he made the same point. GDP is a measure of economic activity. It does not directly measure the quality of education, the integrity of people's debate, the quality of our marriages. So when economists focus so much on things like how rich is a country, what's its GDP per capita, is GDP per capita going up or down, is the GDP of the people the 10th percentile going up or down, they're not measuring what seems like really would matter. And you might worry that in a way, we're like a lot of our public policy is focusing on the things that don't matter rather than the things that do. So as a first pass, that seems pretty compelling. But we're social scientists and we can do better than that. And we're also not running for office. We're not manipulating people to get them to vote for us. We're just trying to say what's true. I think we need to give money a better hearing than that and see what money really does for us. So one way to start, just as an intellectual exercise, this is something I do with my students. And if we were all in person and talking with one another, we'd probably take a break to do this, but I'll just discuss it with you and you can think about it on your own. I think it's useful for you to make a list of the following kinds of goods. So put aside things like shelter and basic clothing and basic food that you need to live, but think about the kinds of things you spend your money on, the kinds of goods and services that you tend to consume that aren't strictly speaking necessary for you to live. Now think of make a list of different kinds of things. List number one, think about a consumer good or service that you genuinely love. You really makes your life a lot better. Your life would be a lot worse without it. It's in fact, it's so good that you'd be willing to give up a lot of your friends for it if you're honest with yourself. I don't mean like if a genie came and said, I'm going to kill your friend Bob or take away your car, pick one. I mean, just, you can't be friends with Bob, you get to keep your car or your horse or whatever it might be, your ski trips. Now tend to think of for item number two, think of consumer goods that you tend to buy, but you could do without. If you couldn't buy them anymore, it really wouldn't affect your life. Now for item three, think about things that you want, but you wish you didn't want. Maybe there's something you desire, but at the same time, if you could take like a pill or medicine that made the desire go away, you'd be willing to take that pill. And finally, let's be judgmental. Think about consumer goods that other people want that you wish they didn't want. So for me, this is kind of easy. I'm an avid guitar player and I have too much guitar stuff, but frankly, like my central guitar stuff, it really makes my life a lot better. I'd have a much worse life if I didn't have access to that. And it's not just having an electric guitar and amplifier. I have really nice guitars and really nice amplifiers. Like the stuff, like when I was a little kid listening to like heavy metal bands, and like they're playing Mesa Boogie Mark II C pluses. When I'm older, I'm going to own one of those. And I do. And it's great. And I love it. And frankly, I love it a lot more than most of my friends. Like when it comes down to it, that's really enriching my life. But then a lot of things I buy, I could do without. Maybe I buy like some effects pedal or a tube or something for the amplifier. It doesn't really make much of a difference. Then there are things I want that I wish I didn't want. Like I kind of have a taste for fancy cars now. I like fast cars, but I sort of wish I didn't. Like if I could just make that taste go away, I think I'd be willing to do so. And as far as things other people want that I wish they didn't want, maybe in college I would have answered like Dave Matthews Band. Like it was annoying. People were constantly playing that in the dormitory, and I had to experience because of that. Now, the point of this exercise is not just to have fun and engage in self-reflection. It's to note that the way that you relate to material objects and consumption that is mediated through money, including services like skiing and travel that you might buy, varies. Some of the things that you're spending your money on, even upon reflection, are greatly enriching your lives. Some are having hardly any effect. Some are maybe making your life worse. So one of the immediate lessons of this is that if your money is not making you happy, you're not doing it right, right? Like your money can make you happy. You just have to be better about how you spend it. So partly it's a strategic thing, but then we can take a step back and ask, well, what does money do for us in general? How does it affect people's lives? So I have here a figure about work and the amount of time people spend working in the United States at different parts of the US history. This is looking at the average American throughout history. Now, in the year 1870, the United States is probably the third richest country in the world per capita, which also makes it the third richest country that has ever existed by a large margin, by the way. It's not even close, even in 1870. So it's like the Netherlands, Argentina, England, Australia, those are like the richest countries. And there's some question about which one is exactly the richest, but they're much richer than the countries that have come before them. In the year 1870, if you're the typical American in what is perhaps the richest or maybe the third richest country ever to have existed on the face of the earth, here's what your life is like. You start working full time at age 13. I have a 13-year-old kid upstairs. It's hard for me to, he actually does work for school, is a lot of work, but it's hard for me to imagine him working full time and having to like earn a living and support himself through work. He's still a kid, but that's what he would have to do if he'd been alive in 1870. Your life expectancy at birth in the third richest country ever to exist is only 44 years. That doesn't mean that when you get to be 44, you're almost dead. It's just because at that time, something like 40% of children who are born in the United States would die before the age of 5. It was just normal for your kids to die. Even if you were rich, it was normal for your kids to die. Retirement age, it says death. And the reason it says death is because retirement wasn't a thing. You just worked until you were too sick and old to work anymore. And then you kind of laid down in a bed and your kids fed you for a week or two and then you died. That was normally how it worked. You did not retire. The years that you would spend working full time would typically be about 30 to 31 years. And the reason it's so low is just because a lot of people died. So in reality, if you made it to age 5, you'd spend a lot more time working, but you would work until your death. Here's how much people worked. The average person in 1870 worked 3,000, almost 3,100 hours a year for pay, plus almost 2,000 hours a year not for pay. For women, it tended to be a little bit more of the not for pay work, and for men, it tended to be a little bit more of the for pay work. Over the course of your lifetime, you could expect to spend 61% of your life awake and working, either for money or for something that you would consider a chore. You'd have hundreds of thousands of hours working and only about 100,000 hours of leisure. Now, fast forward to 2007. I don't actually have all the numbers for right now, but they've gotten better. The average adult today, or even 2007, starts working full time around 20, and that number just keeps going up. Their life expectancy is higher. They retire. There used to be no retirement. They retire younger and younger, 62 and a half. My mom just retired. She's 61 or 62. She just turned 62. All right. She's retired. That's it. She's not going to work anymore. You would work more years in the job on average because you live longer, but the amount that you worked would be lower. The amount of time you're spending would be in retirement would be lower. You'd spend only about half the total amount of time working and doing chores, and you'd have hundreds of thousands of more hours of leisure time. So the average American today ends up having something like 350 to 360,000 hours of leisure time compared to the average American in 1870, in the third richest country ever to have existed at the time, who would have under 100,000. It changes how we live our lives. Like, here's some numbers. In the year 1950, the average stay-at-home mother would spend only about 10 hours a week directly interacting with her children. Now, in 2021, the average working father spends about 15 to 20 hours directly interacting with their children per week. We spend a lot more time on those sorts of things than we used to. Work ain't what it used to be. My job involves like writing books and talking into a camera. Like, well, it used to be in talking in person. Like, it's easy. If someone like me had been born in Lowell, Massachusetts, where I was born 100 years earlier, I would have worked 70-hour weeks in some sort of clothing mill. I wouldn't have been educated, and I would be sweaty, and like my arms would be ruined from like the kind of work that I would do. So we have tons more leisure because of money. Most of you have probably encountered this idea before of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. The idea here is that the things on the bottom here are the most urgent. They're the things that you tend to go to first. The things on the top of this pyramid are the things that are most important. They're what makes your life good or valuable, or like a life that you're happy to have had. But realistically speaking, as a description of how human beings behave, you tend not to pursue these things until you secure these things, in part because you have to. So you need to make sure that you're not being crushed by too much or too little air pressure, that you have enough to breathe, that you have some water, that you have food and you can sleep. And then you start going for other kinds of security. When you look at this pyramid, what you might note is that money can buy you a lot of stuff at the bottom of the pyramid, right? It can even buy you some of the stuff here too, depending on what state you live in. Not in Tennessee, but I guess in Nevada it can. What it can't do is buy you this stuff up here. None of this stuff is for sale. Problem solving, the ability to become a good problem solver, not for sale. The ability to become less prejudiced, not for sale. Though there were people that will take your money from you to teach you to be less prejudiced, but it doesn't actually work, but you can still sell it. But the actual lack of prejudice is not in fact for sale. Self-esteem and confidence and respect, they're not for sale. But one hypothesis that seems plausible is that maybe people who are richer get more of this stuff because even though you can't buy it, money protects you from this. Money gets you this stuff, which makes you secure and free enough to go and pursue these other things, maybe without a guarantee of getting them, but nevertheless a better chance. If you're spending all of your time worried about whether you're going to eat, you're probably not going to spend a lot of time thinking about how you can realize your creative potential and transcend yourself into something higher. But maybe not. It's a scientific hypothesis. How would we know? Well, the nice thing is we do know. We can go and check, and there's lots of studies. So one thing is, does money buy happiness? And the answer is, yeah, sort of it does. This is a surprising thing. When I was in college, like back in the late 90s and early 2000s, when I was in college, I was taught that the effect of money on happiness is like this. As you get richer, you get happier and happier until you get about $15,000 in current US dollars. And then money has the absolute level of money you have has no real effect on your happiness. It just plateaus. It's true that if you're richer than your neighbors, you're happier, but it doesn't matter if you have 100,000 and they have 50, or if you have 50 and they have 25. All it is a comparison. The whole world would be just as happy if everyone had $15,000 as if everyone had $100,000. That was the conventional wisdom in like 1997. But then in 2006, a really big study was done by Betsy Stevenson and Justin Wolfers, looking at a tremendous amount of data about how money affects happiness. And here's a great summary by Daniel Kahneman, Nobel laureate, who changed his mind because of these studies. He says the effects of income on a measure of life satisfaction are not small at all. In fact, it turns out the GDP differences between countries are enormous, but they're highly predictive of differences in life satisfaction. In a properly done scientific sample of 130,000 people from over 126 countries, where they're getting a proper sample from every country they go to, the correlation between the measured life satisfaction of individuals and the GDP of their country in which they live was over 0.4, exceptionally high value in social sciences. Apparently, people around the world evaluate their lives on the basis of money, and the more richer people are in absolute terms, the happier they tend to be. But it's not just that. The same study asked people about a wide range of emotions, and they found a lot of interesting things. Enjoyment is strongly correlated with being richer. And the absence of physical pain is strongly correlated with being richer. Worry, by the way, this is an interesting one, is actually positively correlated with money. And part of that seems to be because as people get richer, they tend to be more forward thinking. When you're poorer, you tend to be thinking very short term, but sort of by necessity. Sadness is negatively correlated with money. Boredom is negatively correlated with money. Depression negatively correlated with money. Anger is negatively correlated with money. Love is positively correlated with money. Even this understates it. If you were to do, say, something like a sociological survey of the United States, what you'll tend to find nowadays is that in the US, rich people, upper middle class, college educated people with high incomes tend to have very stable and happy marriages, and other people don't. Some of that's something called the selection effect, but a lot of it is just when you have money, you don't worry about money as much, and that prevents a lot of the problems that cause bad marriage. But what else is money buying us? It's buying us life. Right? There's a really cool video I could show you. If you were in my class, I'd show it to you. I won't do it here because it takes up a lot of time, but you can graph the life expectancy of countries against their income. And what you find is that, say, in the year 200 years ago, basically everyone is down here, actually so low that they're not even on this map anymore. They're all down in this lower quadrant where everywhere in the world, everyone is sick and poor. And then as countries got richer, they move up here to this quadrant of being rich and living a long time. It's hard to imagine a greater increase in your freedom than living twice as long and having like the expectation to do so. If you were living in England in the year 1000 and you have a newborn child, this baby that you're holding in your hand, its life expectancy is 26 years. How much are you going to invest in that kid? What are you going to dream for it? You don't think that way anymore. And the nice thing is everybody is moving in this direction. All these countries that are down here are moving up here as we speak. It's wonderful. Beyond that, money buys us simple things like light. Light, like I'm in a room, it's, and it's light in here. Light used to be incredibly expensive. Here's a graph showing just how much cheaper it is now over time. In about 500 years ago, to get what's called 1,000 lumen hours of light, you'd have to work something like 20 hours. Now the average American has to work about 20 seconds to get that much light. So the ritual of reading to your kids before they go to bed, that's an expensive ritual that's cheap for us now because light and books and knowledge are cheap. It used to be these things were incredibly expensive and thus out of the grasp of the typical person. So nevertheless, people tend to have the view that money is a bad thing, and we tend to disparage money making, right? Even if okay, so there's a lot to be said for having money. It makes us happier, it makes us more loving, it makes us more generous, and a bunch of other things that even get to. It has all these positive effects. What about the making of money? So some researchers, Amit Bhattacharjee and a number of his colleagues, did some really cool studies just to sort of test to prove that we have what they call anti-profit beliefs or an anti-profit bias. What they would do in these studies is simply describe hypothetical companies to people and ask them to evaluate them. And they would say things like, I would describe to you one company and I would give you all exactly the same information about it, but tell you that they make a 5% profit rate or a 10% profit rate. And then I'd describe another country and say that they make, another company and say that they make no profit or negative profit. And then he would ask people, how much destruction do you think this company is doing? How bad are they for the environment? Are they ethical or unethical? And what he found is that basically the more profit a company makes, the more people just assume that they are causing harm. And the less profit they make, the more they assume that they're doing good. People just assume that profit is a bad thing. If you've ever heard the experiment that people do, that's very similar, where you give people a bunch of resumes and some have names that sound like white names and some have names that sound like black names, but the resumes are otherwise identical. And then it turns out that people rank the black name resume lower than the white name resume. That's the thing that shows prejudice against blacks. This is the same kind of experiment, but it's showing a prejudice against profit. There's an assumption that profit is harmful, even though there's no evidence for that in this experiment itself. It's just displaying a prejudice. Why do people think that? What should we say about making money? Well, you can see why people might think this way. For one, when you think about the moral architecture of our brains and how we are designed to think about evolution and the evolution of humanity. We lived in small family-based clans of about 100 to 120 people for almost all of human history. Only for really like the last 600 generations or so have we lived in large groups, like cities and city states and villages and nations, where we're cooperating on a massive scale. So a lot of our moral intuitions, the architecture of our brains, I teach a whole class on this, the architecture, moral architecture of our brains is designed for face-to-face interaction on something like a Survivor TV show. That's like what we're for, is to live as hunter-gatherers in a small environment. And our mental architecture and our moral architecture is evolved to be adaptive for that situation. It's not evolved to be adaptive to the kind of environment we live in now, where we cooperate on a mass scale. I mean, just to illustrate what I mean, I have here a simple highlighter, a cheap little object you can buy for like 50 cents at Target. And you ask yourself, how many people contributed to building this highlighter? The average person who hasn't taken an econ class would probably say, I don't know, like maybe there were like 50 people at the factory. So 50 people made that together. A better estimate is 50 million. Something like 50 million human beings worked together to make this, though maybe only 50 of them knew they were actually building it. If you trace out the history of all the people working to build this, making the machines that make the machines that make the machines that make the ink that goes into this thing, it's 50 million. We're cooperating on a mass scale, but our moral architecture is not evolved with that. We've gotten it very quickly. We haven't really caught up. Beyond that, we have kind of a cultural architecture. If you go back to say like reading the Bible and you ask, what does Jesus mean when he says it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of the needle than for a rich man to get into heaven? Why might he say that? Well, think about how the economy worked in his time. This is kind of what it was like throughout most of human history. You have a bunch of peasants and they do all the work. And then over them, you have a military unit and maybe a religious unit and a king or nobles or lords or shoguns or whatever they might be called, who just kind of dominate them. These people don't really do any work for them. They don't really provide much in the way of services for the peasants, but they dominate over them through sheer physical force. So the poor feed the rich, but the rich get their food simply by taking. They're not providing a service. They're not exchanging. They're just dominating. Even that's actually a little bit unfair to kings. They did do some services. I don't want to overstate that. But that was what it was like through most of human history. Almost everyone everywhere is dirt poor, and the rich are rich almost always through direct expropriation, through coercion of the poor. So, the rich people in Jesus's day, almost all of them really were horrible people. Yeah, it makes sense. They are horrible people. What about the rich people today? Not so clear. Things have changed. One way to illustrate this is with a game that I play in class. And if we were in person, I'd probably play this game with you, but we can't. The way the game works is I walk into class on the first day and I give everybody a unique candy bar. So if I have 50 students, I buy 50 unique candy bars. I just distribute them at random. I don't care what you like it or not. I just give you a random candy bar. And I ask all of my students to rate their candy bars on a scale of 1 to 10 for how happy they are. Then what I do is I give them about 10 minutes to trade. They can make as many trades as they want with anyone else who's willing to trade with them. So maybe you start with the Reese's peanut butter cup and you end with the Milky Way, because that's what I would try to do. I hate Reese's cups. I hate peanut butter, but I like Milky Way. So I try to go for that. And then after all the trading is done and everything dies down and the market is cleared, I ask them to rate their candy again. Inevitably, it goes up, and it goes up dramatically. The more students in the class, the more diversity of candy, the more it goes up. It'll go from like the scores, like say 120 at the beginning of the class, and then after they trade, it'll be like 300. What happened there, quite realistically, is that they created wealth by trading with one another, not even inventing new candies, not coming up with a recipe, simply by trading with one another in the basis of their preferences. Everyone gets richer. No one gets to be worse off. The worst that can happen to you is that no one trades with you and you're stuck with the candy you get. But what ends up happening almost always is that everyone trades and everyone's happier at the end. We literally create wealth just by interacting with each other. Well, this kind of interaction is what's called trade. And trade has been going on for a long time. What effect has it had? I can show you with this graph. This is looking at GDP per capita throughout human history, going up until the year 2003. It keeps going up past that, but I'm using data from a particular person who retired around then. So that's why I stop at that point. What you'll notice is it looks like a hockey stick, and I condense it, and I don't even bother go back further than this because it's just flat. Throughout almost all of human history, basically everyone everywhere is poor, living in what we would now consider extreme poverty, living on roughly $1 a day or less. And only a few people, the kings and the shoguns and the emperors and the khans and so on, are living any better than that. And then things start to change. We have two phenomena that take place. One is the great enrichment. people genuinely start getting richer. Their income grows faster than the population. People become better off. So as a result, it's literally the case that the typical person living in the United Kingdom today is about 50 times richer in absolute inflation and cost of living adjusted terms, 50 times richer than the typical person living in England 1,000 years ago. That's how much better off they are. Not 10%, not 20%, 50 times richer. But you also have a great divergence. Everyone gets richer, but some places get richer faster than others, right? Though for what it's worth, we're now getting a reconvergence where these places are catching up. So that's an interesting phenomenon. We're so much richer than we were in the past, and because of the unleashing of market forces. Even if you look just more recently, this is all the countries in the world between 1960 and 2014. Anything above this line are countries that got richer. Below it are countries that got poorer. The poverty is usually caused by civil war, an AIDS epidemic, or so on. The richer countries got richer here. And the countries that get rich fastest are the ones that become the most capitalistic and free market. They're the ones that get richer and richer and richer. When we think about what it is to serve one another, like imagine President Obama said something like this during his campaign. He says, I want to help people get richer by creating an economic environment that encourages beneficial innovation. He actually did say things like that, but that's not a verbatim quote. When he gets up on front of a podium and says, this is how I want to serve the country and the world, is by creating a legal environment which encourages innovation, and that will make everyone better off. We clap our hands and we say, that's an exercise of civic virtue. But if we agree that that's an exercise of civic virtue, what should we say when Sergey Brin says, well, I want to help people by innovating? Shouldn't we say the same thing? It would be weird if we didn't. If Obama says, I want to create an environment that encourages people like Sergey Brin to innovate, yay, civic virtue. And then Sergey Brin's like, I'm innovating. We should clap our hands to him too. That's the primary way that he's serving people. Like maybe he gives money to causes. Maybe he votes the right way. If he does, great. But honestly, who cares? Sergey Brin will do a lot more good this morning by the stuff he does at Google, or as of today, as of this morning, than he will do by all of the votes he casts over his entire life or by all the money that he donates, right? He is serving everyone by doing that kind of stuff. Jeff Bezos is going to do, this sounds like a really mean thing to say, but it's absolutely true. It will offend you and it's completely correct and it shouldn't offend you, but it will. Jeff Bezos, when he was running Amazon, will do more good for everyone else in the world in one day than a typical kindergarten teacher will do over her entire lifetime. But it's not even a close comparison. But it's not just true of big innovators like them. It's true of all of us. The typical motorcycle mechanic is doing a lot of good for people simply by fixing motorcycles. And he's not simply helping his direct customers. He's helping indirectly by creating a sphere and a web of cooperation that is leading to this, that's making all of us richer, making all of us freer, making us all live better lives. So sometimes you hear business schools say things like this. This is the former dean of Wharton, the business school at the University of Pennsylvania, which is frequently recognized as the #1 business school. So yeah, not my school, their school. At Wharton, he says, we believe the role of business is to advance society as a whole by creating new wealth and economic opportunity for all people in developing regions as well as the developed countries. That is how business people serve. And he's right to say that. He's not taking it easy on business people. If anything, serving people this way is an incredibly demanding thing, and most people are quite bad at it. It's hard to do. When you think about corporate social responsibility, some companies will tell you all about the way that they donate their money. And that's fine. Donating money is a great thing if you do it the right way. But I like what FedEx has to say. Their fundamental argument is we serve the world by making it easier for people to cooperate and trade with one another. The fundamental thing that we do to be a socially responsible citizen as a company is to provide our core product to other people. And our core product makes the world better. That really is fundamentally what it is to be a good business. If your business can't say that about itself, I don't care if you're donating money to something or not, you're not really serving the world. That's what it is to be a good business. And they're not taking it easy on themselves. They really are helping that way. It's sometimes strange that we don't give them credit for that. If, lots of other jobs like teachers and medical doctors and politicians, we clap for what they do, but then we don't clap for what business people do, even though business people are responsible for us being so much richer and living so much longer and all these other things. So one way of putting this is my friend Chris McDonald, who's a business professor up in Toronto. He says one way of putting the idea that that businesses should just donate their money, it's not about their core product, it's kind of unfair to businesses, because the way of putting it is to say it makes perfect sense to admit that a business makes a useful product or provides a useful service at prices that other people are willing to pay, such that when those people consume that product or that service, they profit from it. They're like, I am better off consuming this than I'm not. They provide employment for people. They provide investment opportunities for others. They scrupulously follow the laws or the regulations. They pay their taxes. A lot of businesses do all this stuff. And then we turn to them and go, yeah, but how do you contribute to society? How does society figure into your daily decision-making? It's unfair. It's in a way like we're not giving them credit for what they've done. And what they've done is, frankly, a lot, a great deal. Now, I did mention that there is this gap here. Some countries got richer faster than others. And in the book, I spent a lot of time talking about why that is and what economists have to say about it and what our evidence is for it. I'm just going to give you a brief summary of this now. The dominant view among economists for why some countries are rich and other countries are poor is because some countries have better institutions than others. They have better rules of the game that structure economic life, right? This kind of view actually starts with the book, The Wealth of Nations, by the great economist and chair of moral philosophy, Adam Smith. Adam Smith was writing at a time when he looks around, he looks over at, he's living in Scotland, and he wonders, why is it England and Scotland, despite having really lousy weather and hardly any natural resources, or the Netherlands, which is basically reclaimed swampland, why are these countries richer than France and Spain, which have giant empires, bigger empires, and better natural resources? What explains that? And he realizes because the Netherlands and the UK had economic systems that encouraged growth and the other countries did not. This stuff has been borne out. Like, if you can read a good book on this called Why Nations Fail, this is what they've scrupulously tested this. I'm happy to talk about how, and that's what the evidence shows. Further, Adam Smith, if you don't know, you might not know this, but The Wealth of Nations was the first major and important critique of imperialism. So what he does in the book 4 of The Wealth of Nations is he measures how much money does Great Britain spend on creating its empire. Empires aren't free. You have to feed and house troops and create ships and buy guns and shoot people. It's expensive to do that, right? How much money do they spend doing that? And how much do they get back in return? So what he finds is Great Britain, basically for every dollar's worth of goods that they're stealing from other people through their empire, they're paying $2 in taxes. What he ends up concluding is it's a thing that helps the king and it helps the arms manufacturers and it hurts everybody else. The empire, rather than making the country rich, is actually hurting the poor people in their country, let alone the horrible things it's doing to, say, Native Americans and others who are also being harmed by it. Turns out Adam Smith is right. We have really good data, better than he had on this point. And in fact, empires were losing money, not making money. So it is true that, like, the European countries engaged in a lot of imperialism. That imperialism has negative effects that redound even to this day. It's not the explanation for why they're rich and other countries are poor. In fact, if anything, it made them poorer than they otherwise would be. So one final thing is about keeping money. All right, I have a pretty common sense view of this, which is, when you're richer, you should give back in all sorts of ways. You should have a career that gives back simply by having that career. There's lots and lots of ways to contribute to society. You don't even have to have a career. You can do other kinds of things. There's lots and lots of ways of making a positive contribution, such that at the end of your life, you can say, I paid my dues. I don't owe anyone anything else. I did my part. One of the things you can do is to give to charity, if you give to the right kind of charity. Some charities are terrible. Some charities are great. If you want to do a lot of good, give money to something like Deworm the Earth Initiative or Against Malaria Foundation. If you want to do a lot of harm, give money to Scared Straight. For every dollar you give them, you do $200 worth of harm to society. And there's everything in between. Like, and I also agree that, like, the richer you are, the more you should give, in part because it's easier for you to do so. For me to donate $500 right now barely affects me, whereas when I was 20, I didn't have $500 to donate. Oprah Winfrey, because she's so rich, can build a school and it has almost no effect on her lifestyle, whereas I can't afford to build a school. I don't have that kind of money. So I agree with that kind of common sense view that the richer you are, the more other beneficence is available to you. It's easier for you to be beneficent, and you should look for helping others through beneficence. But some people think that's not enough. So for instance, the famous philosopher Peter Singer has a thought experiment that, even if you've never read his paper, you've probably heard this thought experiment before. He says, imagine that you're walking across, say, campus, and you come across a child drowning in a pool. you're wearing like your brand new expensive like suede shoes and your suede pants and your suede jacket, and you don't have time to take that stuff off in order to save the kid. So if you jump in and save that kid, you're going to lose $500 worth of clothing. And he asks, do you think, according to you, is it morally obligatory, not nice, but obligatory for you to save that kid? Almost everyone who hears that question says yes. You are obligated to save that kid, even if it costs you $500, right? It's not simply a supererogatory nice thing to do, but you'd be morally blameworthy if you didn't. So Singer makes a really good point. He says, if you agree that you should save that kid at the cost of $500, why don't you save someone for $500 right now? You can go to Deworm the Earth Initiative, go on Google, look that up, give them $500, and you will expect, for every 50 cents you give them, you can expect to help kids tremendously, remove worms from them, stop their stunted growth, add a whole bunch of life years. Last semester, I was giving money to site savers during certain talks, and I'm like, I've just extended people's for $100 in a gift. My expected values have increased people's life expectancy by 25 years. You can do a tremendous amount of good for not that much money if you go to, say, givewell.org and find the charities that work. So why not do that? Well, that seems reasonable. But then Singer says, if you agree you should give away the first 500, why not the next 500? Why not, in fact, say you should keep giving up until the point that you're just as poor as the people that you're trying to help? It's so you keep giving money away until you're at the point where, like, if you gave away money, they'd have to turn around and give you money because you're worse off than they are. After all, he's like, if you agree you should give the kid the money, or you should lose money to save the kid, now just imagine it happens one more time. Do you want to say the same thing? Now imagine it one more time. Do you want to say the same thing? There doesn't appear to be a principled cutoff point for you to say, I shouldn't save a life at the expense of something else. And so it looks like charity could be an all-consuming thing. The thing is, and I go into a lot of detail in the book, but I'll just give you the basics of it. There's some worries about this. One is that the thought experiment doesn't seem to prove quite what he thinks it proves, because the thought experiment he gives you is there's one kid drowning and it'll cost you $500 to save him, but then you get to go live your life. And almost everyone thinks it's obligatory. What's maybe a thought experiment that's more analogous to the situation you face right now as a person who's in a position to give. And if you're watching this, you're one of those people. I don't care if you're a college student and you have hardly any income, you're still richer than almost everyone else in the world, like by a lot. So I'm talking about you. The thought experiment would instead be something like, imagine you're walking across campus and you see a giant pool with an infinite number of children who continuously fall in. And every time you pull a child out, that child will, for the most part, stay safe. They're unlikely to fall back in, but there's always more children falling in. So you can spend every waking moment of your life saving kids, and you will save the kids that you save, but you'll have nothing. You can just like spend all your time like sleeping and eating only for the purpose of saving children. Are you obligated to spend all of your life saving kids? Well, then it's not so clear. The fact that we agree you must save this one kid, it doesn't follow we therefore agree that you have to save them all. We might think that at a certain point, it's regrettable and you've done your part and you can move on. And that's kind of the common sense view. But if anything, I think Peter Singer's taking it too easy on giving, because there's actually some real dilemmas here that Singer ignores that actually make it genuine moral dilemmas. One is that when you think about why countries are rich and countries are poor, the answer is the countries that got rich because they had functional institutions that encourage productivity and capital formation. The countries that are poor are countries that don't have those institutions. We don't have a history of countries becoming rich because they got a handout. Peter Singer would say something like in 1970, he would say to Americans, don't buy a bunch of cheap electronics that you don't need. Spend all the money giving it to poor people. But the fact that Americans didn't take his advice is why South Korea is now a rich country that is in a position to maybe give, rather than a poor country that's in a position to be given to. This buying crap we don't need is part of what puts us in a position where we're not so needy. So you have to take that into account. You can't simply ignore that. Further, there's a real dilemma here about charity versus investment. When you put money into, say, a stock market account or invested in something, you might not be feeding somebody right now, but you are feeding people in the future, right? Just think of like something simple. If you put money in a stock market account, like $100 in a stock market account with an index fund that just matches the Dow Jones, and imagine the Dow over the next 50 years does like the equivalent of the Dow over the past 50 years. Well, then 30 years from now, the $100 you put in is going to be worth like well over $3,000. However many people, and like adjusted for inflation, however many people you could feed right now with $100, you can feed a tremendous number more in 50 years. And on the time that you did it, you would have been buying people college and buying them a car and buying people opportunities to work and so on. So there actually is a genuine dilemma here. And I'm not sure what the answer is. If you give money to someone who's starving now, you stop them from starving. And that really is a pressing need and a reason to give. It's also true that if you invest your money the right way and run a business the right way, then you're stopping people from needing that help in the future and even possibly now. It's not just as simple as giving helps and not giving doesn't help. You're actually faced with a much harder dilemma, which is, what's the best use of my money if I really want to help people? For a lot of businesses, by the way, it's like your giving behavior, you would do a lot more good reinvesting your money in your core business than you would through giving. I teach an entire class on this point, and the truth is, most of us are not very good at charity. We don't spend a lot of time thinking carefully about what charities to give to. We don't give to charities that are very effective. We mostly give to charities that sound good or are popular rather than charities that actually do a lot of good. And when, on the other hand, we invest our money, we tend to be pretty careful about putting it in places that actually work. So Singer, I think, oversimplifies the situation we find. He's like, if you're willing to save one kid, you should be willing to save them all. It's not clear you actually agree to that, even if you agree you should save one. And contra Singer, there's a real dilemma here about whether investing versus giving is the optimal way to serve other people. Even if you were just purely altruistic, it's really a genuine dilemma. So I think that kind of wraps it up. Like, you know, to go back to the starting point, the view that most people have is this. They might not fully agree with it, but they believe this partly. It's wrong to make money, wrong to want money, wrong to keep it. I think there's a lot to be said. Money deserves your desire. Money is worth wanting. It makes you happier, healthier, life go better, have more leisure, freer. It's okay to make money if you make it the right way, through productive trade rather than through expropriation. And it's okay to keep most of the money that you have, though, yeah, the richer you get, the more you should give back through other means. But giving back is a lot more complicated than you might think. So with that, thanks for hearing me out, and I'm happy to take your comments, your objections, and your questions at this time.
Thank you, Jason. That was fantastic. We'll jump in right here. Some people had some questions early on. This was a little bit of a long one. I find your argument that people think being rich is bad is an odd premise. I think the vast majority of Americans just want billionaires and corporations to pay their fair share of taxes. Warren Buffett famously offered $1 million prize to any wealthy person who could show that they were paying more in taxes as a percentage of their income than their personal assistant was paying. The prize went unclaimed. If the wealthy are so overtaxed, how are they able to accumulate such huge quantities of cash? I don't know anyone who thinks that wealthy people shouldn't exist, just that people pay the same percentage of their income in taxes that a middle-class person pays.
Yeah, that's a great comment. And in the book, I try to go through some of the studies that show what people think about this. And like, there's surveys and studies about what people think. So here's some of the stuff that we find. If you just ask Americans, like you go and survey them and say, how good do you think a person is? Like you might have heard, like you look up the average person and I say, here's a guy named Robert Kennedy, and here's a guy named Saddam Hussein. But he's an American, not the dictator. They're likely to think that Kennedy is like better than like a person with a Middle Eastern sounding last name because of prejudice, right? You probably have heard of those kinds of studies. Similar studies have been done for people based on their income levels. It turns out that most Americans believe that the richer you are, the bigger of a jerk you are. They assume that rich people are mean, uncaring, uncouth, unsympathetic. They're not very benevolent. They're willing to screw over other people and take advantage of them. So our moral attitudes towards the rich is that they're actually very mean people. Again, these are surveys and that's sort of the average. There's disparities. Not everyone thinks this way, but the bulk of Americans do think that. And again, as far as like wanting money too, the bulk of Americans, I think it's of two minds. We want more money, but we also think less of them. Even the stuff about paying their fair share of taxes, what's odd about this is that the rich pay almost all of the taxes. It's one of those things that economists like love to kind of make fun of. Like you survey Americans and you're like, who pays the taxes? And they're like, everyone knows the rich don't pay much in taxes. No, the rich pay almost all the income tax. I could probably call up a table if you need to see it right now because I have it from some other class. We have actually in the United States we have a lower overall tax burden in the US than many other countries. If you lived in Denmark, you'd be taxed at a higher rate, but we actually have a very progressive tax system. People in the bottom quintile of income in the US, they pay about $500 a year in taxes. I had this chart up in my class like 2 days ago, and they get back about $17,000. They pay negative taxes. People in the top quintile pay a tremendous amount more in taxes. Almost all of the federal income tax is paid by the top 10%. And even in that, most of it ends up being paid by the top 1%. And you might say, well, they have more of the money. That's right. We have a very progressive tax system. And in fact, the rich do pay a lot in taxes. When people are always like, the rich need to pay their fair share, it's like, what do you think their fair share would be? This is a real experiment, by the way. You survey people and ask them, what do you think they should pay? And the number that they give you that they consider their fair share is actually lower than the rich, in fact, pay, right? I'm not even all that rich, but I did my taxes pretty recently. I paid like $90,000 last year in taxes. That's more than the average. That's more than the median US household. I paid the government more in taxes than the median US household. And I'm just a college professor at a business school. I'm not Warren Buffett, right? So I think people do get mad about things like capital gains tax because you're not taxed at a very high rate for investment. But you should take, on that, I would just say take an econ class. The optimal capital gains tax is 0. I think that's pretty uncontroversial among economists, but very controversial among lay people. So, and you also do see people say, like, I have this on Facebook now. It's like, people do think billionaires shouldn't exist. You know, no one should ever be that rich as to be a billionaire. And part of the reason I think is that they don't understand what it is to be a billionaire. When they picture Jeff Bezos, who has, you know, $120 billion in terms of his net worth, they're picturing Scrooge McDuck and his giant money pit where the money just sits there and does nothing. But the truth is that most of Jeff Bezos' wealth is in the form of warehouses and trucks. So like, as I'm talking, like the Amazon truck literally came by and dropped off some stuff. That's his wealth. It's mostly serving me. It's not most, I'm sure he has a wonderful house and a really nice car and multiple vacation homes and things like that. But that's where most of his money is. And it's also worth noting, when we think about innovators like that, William Nordhaus was an economist who won the Nobel Prize about 3 years ago now. He did a big study on like, how much do innovators make? He finds that the typical big innovator like Bezos only captures about 2% of the total value that they make for the world. The other 98% goes to everybody else. So yeah, I think Americans do have the view they should pay their fair share of taxes, but they're mistaken about how much the people actually pay. The rich pay almost all the taxes. The lower, like the middle class downward, pays almost no taxes. They mostly receive money back.
Well, we have a really good follow-up question. It fits perfectly with that. Adam Smith and others following in his philosophy would argue that enforceable property rights are critical to a prosperous society. At what point do you believe taxation crosses into confiscation of a person's property, thereby resulting in less overall wealth?
Yeah, that's very good. There's a very famous paper by Achimoglu and Robinson and Johnson about protection against expropriation of property. And they make the argument that, and these are not libertarian, I wouldn't even necessarily call them hardcore free market guys, but they make the argument that the protection of private property is one of the central things that makes countries rich. The countries that do a good job protecting private property are almost all rich, and the countries that don't are basically all poor. And you can even measure what happens when these institutions change. When they become more protective, the country gets richer. When they become less protective, the country becomes poor. What's not clear to me is like, is there an X% of tax where at that point it becomes really destructive? I don't know if that's well supported in the literature. We all kind of understand that, like, if the government taxed 99% of your income, no one would work, no one would bother. It's why even bother? So production would be lower. And if they tax less, you do more. But there is a real trade-off, because some of what government does with taxes are provide services and protection and stability and other kinds of things that actually enhance prosperity rather than demote it. And so some of the money that we're paying into government is actually redounding back to us and making us better off. And for that reason, it's hard to say what the percent is. But, you know, it is worth noting, though, that like when you look at like a lot of European countries that have, say, tax rates of 50%, they tend to be slower growing than the countries that have tax rates of like 30%. So I'm guessing it's somewhere around there, but I can't like give you a really scientific answer about like what the number is. I can just give you a rough estimate at best.
Thank you. Next question. Just quoting the key issue, the actual solution to poverty might not be handouts, but institutions and practices. Then she asks, could this be an institutional solution like Medicare for all and practices like minimum wage tied to a GDP increase, such as like $35 per hour?
Yeah, here are the things that, you would hear this from almost any mainstream economist would say. The institutions which we know are part of the package that make countries rich are stable government, characterized by the rule of law, competitive elections, so open government, strong protection of private property, and free and open markets. And why nations fail, they even simplify that to say what they call extractive institutions versus open institutions or inclusive institutions. In terms of things like welfare policy, that's a little bit more puzzling because there's actually a real dilemma here. I have a bit of a beef with the welfare state because I think the welfare state's a really right-wing institution, which sounds like a weird thing to say. Everyone thinks it's weird. I'm really much farther to the left than John Rawls or like Noam Chomsky is by like a lot, even though they would call me like a right-wing person, but they're just incorrect. And here's why. When you think about what the welfare state does in modern, like European or Japan or Korea or like other developed countries or the United States or Canada, what the welfare state is redistribution from very, very rich. Actually, for the most part, it's social insurance. It's mostly just I pay into Social Security and then I get some money back. I pay into unemployment. If I lose my job, I get money back. And the amount that I get is proportional to the amount that I get in. That's most of what the welfare state does. A little bit of it is genuine redistribution. I pay money in that goes to like poor moms to feed their kids that because they're needy, not because, and that's what real redistribution. That redistribution, though, for the most part, even in the rich countries, is from very, very, very rich people to people who are by world standards still very rich, just poor by American standards. If you're making $13,000 a year in the US, you're in the top 15% of world income earners, maybe more like top 17%, because I think there's been some growth outside of the US recently. So here's what happens in these countries. In order to protect their welfare states, which transfer from the rich to the merely rich, right, to the very rich to the merely rich, exclude foreigners and don't allow immigration. They create these, as Glenn Vale calls it, the fortress welfare state. They don't want a lot of foreigners coming in because they wouldn't be able to pay them all these welfare benefits. The effect of that in terms of global poverty is massive. When you're done talking to me, Google this paper, $1 trillion bills on the sidewalk by Michael Clemens. What it will do is give you a review of the economic literature on immigration. The median and mean estimate for like what a world of open immigration would do is that it would double world product. Literally, the amount of wealth has been cut in half in the world. The amount of income has been cut in half because we have closed borders in order to protect these welfare states. And who bears the brunt of that? The genuinely poor outside of the welfare state. So, if our only question is, should we have a higher minimum wage or should we have more redistribution of a certain kind? I think certain kinds of welfare programs in the United States do succeed and do make people better off. But the cost of those things often appears to be we're helping people who are quite well off by world standards. And as a result of that, keeping people who are really badly off much worse off than they otherwise would be. So I tend to regard myself as something of a left-wing critic of the welfare state because I think it's about redistribution between rich people. And what I care about is like world poverty more than what we call poverty in the US, which is quite rich by world standards.
All right. Margaret Michael asks, so are poor people poor because they don't want to be rich?
Yeah, I wonder if you're asking that because if you think, actually, this is a way of putting it. I'm not sure why you're asking that, but I think I might have a hypothesis, and we're not there to ask in person. You can like clarify in the comments too, and that might help if I'm saying something that's misleading or not on point. Here's what's really cool about Adam Smith when he said it's about institutions. Before Adam Smith came along, if you ask people why are some countries rich and others poor, the answers were rich countries have empires. We should build more empires. Rich countries have more virtuous people. God loves our people, but doesn't love their people. And Adam Smith said, people are people. They're about the same everywhere. There's really not a massive difference in virtue. It's not even a massive difference in prudence. The difference is really the rulers. The rulers of France have imposed rules which keep the people poorer than the rulers of the Netherlands have. Right? So it's not like the people in the Netherlands chose to be richer. It's what the kings and the people in power are doing to them. So saying that like institutions explain world poverty, it's not to blame the people. If we're blaming people, what we're doing is blaming the people in charge. And as Achimoglu and Robinson would say in their Why Nations Fail book, the countries that have extractive institutions, the institutions which perpetuate poverty and perpetuate war and perpetuate stagnation, they have a stake in those institutions. It's unfortunate, like the people suffer under them, but the rulers benefit from them. If you've ever seen the, Dr. Seuss book, Yertle the turtles on the bottom of that pyramid, or I guess it's this line, the turtles on the bottom are being crushed, but Yertle on the top, he's pretty happy. So Smith is not blaming the poor and saying the poor are poor because they made bad choices. He's saying the poor are poor because the king mistreats them.
All right. Richie asks, if money is positively correlated with happiness and we are wealthier today than 100 years ago, as you argued, how do you reconcile that with rising depression rates in the United States over the past several decades?
Yeah, that's a good question. So two things. One is in that study that I mentioned, actually, the US is an outlier. Stevenson and Wolfers, if you can Google that paper and download it. They're puzzled because the US is unusually resistant to having the effect of having money have a positive effect on our happiness. They're not really sure why. They do some speculation, but yeah, like they find there's a stereotype that like French people care more about like art and Americans care more about money. But in terms of our actual effect on happiness, money has a bigger effect on the happiness of French people than it does on Americans on a national aggregate level. Again, everyone's an individual. I'm just talking about like as an aggregate, what do you tend to see? So that might be part of it. Another thing though, is like, it's sort of like asking why are autism rates so much higher now than in the past? It might simply be that we're better at measuring this stuff. There's more money being poured into it. We spend more time thinking about mental health. And so we're more aware of it. So even within looking at American data, when we look at the kind of data like about polling people on how happy they are and so on, you do tend to generally see that most Americans are happier today than they were in the past. But higher depression rates might just simply be because we're better at diagnosing depression, in the same way that higher autism rates are probably not because autism's going up. It's just that we're better at diagnosing autism, or we've changed our definition of these things. But that said, even in the Stevenson Wolfers paper, the US is an outlier. So we're one of the weird countries. And so is Japan. The other 128 countries that they sample are all fitting the trend.
All right. Silas Fries asks, as automation and technology improve and unskilled labor becomes less and less necessary, would some sort of UBI redistribution program be ideal to care for the unemployable masses, or something else?
Yeah, that's a really puzzling question. I always wonder about things like that too. People have been making this argument that automation is going to take away everybody's jobs forever, and it's never been true before. So I think by optimistic meta induction would be so far people have been making that argument since the dawn of the machines. Like if you actually know the word sabotage, it comes from like the French word for a particular kind of shoe that people were throwing into machines to break them because they thought the machines were going to put them out of jobs. Thank goodness they failed, because French people are much richer than the people who were throwing in those shoes. I don't know why it would be true 100 years from now if it hasn't been true now. I also don't even know if the idea even makes sense on its own, by its own reckoning. So imagine like Jason Brennan, create a machine that can just instantly make anything for anyone. Well, does that mean we all lose our jobs? Well, either I can just make the machine for myself and use it for myself, in which case it's like I have my own private little economy and I don't need the rest of you, and you all just keep going about your business. If it's Daniel and I are the ones with these two machines and we just interact with each other, you guys just keep doing your business. It's like we don't exist. But then if we need to get you to do anything, like it turns out I can't get the machine to redo my roof, and I ask one of you to like redo my roof, you're going to demand an incredible amount of stuff from me. You're going to like, oh, you want me to redo your roof for you? I need a Ferrari and a jetpack and a private jet and a second Ferrari and blah, blah. In order to get you to do anything, I'm going to have to pay you a tremendous amount. And that's typically what we've seen in the past. As things get cheaper to make, the relative value of labor goes up and the price of labor goes up. That's in fact, basically why we're paid so much today. Labor has not increased anywhere near the speed at which stuff has increased. So that means that in order to get people to do something, you have to pay them a lot more. So I would expect that like automation is going to make a situation in which we're all a lot richer and we won't need that. But that said, if it turns out that I'm wrong about that or something, and we have just a tremendous amount of stuff, yeah, maybe an UBI would be called for. I think it's something worth thinking about in the distant future. I don't think it's worth thinking about much today, because again, I think open immigration beats the welfare state by a lot. Like it's not even close. Again, read like Glenvale's papers on the fortress welfare state, and then read that Michael Clemens article that I mentioned, and you'll see what I'm talking about.
Yes, and I might throw in a suggestion for Mike Munger's book, Tomorrow 3.0, I think, which is really good on this issue. Margaret Michael has another question. Also, why are rich people's feelings of problems significant enough to write a book about?
Good question, Margaret. Here's why. I think your feelings matter, and the book's about you. You're a rich person, and you're going to become a richer person. You're one of the richest people alive now, and and when you're an adult, I don't actually know how old, or maybe you're like 50 for all I know, but I'm assuming you're a college student, and you're a typical college student somewhere between like 18 and 22. If I'm mistaken about that, I'm sorry. Though if I'm mistaken about that, then what I'm saying applies even more. When you're like 50, you're going to be in the top 1% of income earners in the world. And you're going to wonder, am I a bad person for being this rich? Am I, in virtue of having the kind of career that I have, am I a bad person? Should I be doing a different kind of career? Should I be like, volunteering or doing the Peace Corps? Should I be giving away a lot of my money? Is my money like worth, is it actually making me happy, and so on? So this book is about you. I think your feelings matter. And so I'm writing the book for you. I'm not writing the book for Warren Buffett. I guess I think Warren Buffett's feelings matter. He used to sort of be my boss. I used to work for Geico, so I kind of worked for him. But I care about us and me and so on. And I think, so I want to know, I think my feelings matter. And I think your feelings matter. I think Daniel's feelings matter. So I'm talking about us rich people, not just the very, very rich.
All right, another question to follow up, what would be an example of institutions or practices that aren't motivated by profit for the ruling class?
Yeah, great question. People are not pure sociopaths. We do have some degree of altruistic concern. I don't think that like everything Joe Biden does, he's doing just because it benefits him. I don't think that everything that I'm getting a phone call right now from my alma mater asking for money as we're talking. I think that's kind of interesting. But nevertheless, I think there's a subfield of economics called public choice, which is using the tools of microeconomics to sort of model political behavior. A lot of my work is in that. And the fundamental method is to just imagine, for the sake of argument, that people are predominantly self-interested, and then ask what this would predict about their behavior. And it does a pretty good job predicting voter behavior, politician behavior. I actually wrote a whole book about what this means for the academy. I did a public choice analysis of the university system and why college professors and students and administrators act the way that they do. I think people are, for the most part, predominantly self-interested. They're not as altruistic as we often give them credit for, but I don't want to say they're pure sociopaths either. So when politicians are doing what they do, or the ruling class is doing what they do, a lot of it they're doing because it helps them. And oftentimes, the good thing, though, is, and what I'm putting it is, the fact that people are predominantly self-interested, maybe that's too bad, and maybe we'll genetically engineer people to be more altruistic and saintly in the future. But as for now, this is what we have to work with. What you really want are economic and political systems that direct self-interested behavior towards publicly beneficial ends and the benefits of others, right? So the nice thing about markets, when they work well, they don't always work well. They sometimes fail. Not every business is good. I have a whole bunch of stuff about what kinds of businesses are bad in the book. But the nice thing about business and market activity, for the most part, is that the basic way that you make a profit for yourself is by figuring out how to take resources that people value at one level and transform them into resources that other people value at a higher level. If you're able to do that, you get to keep some of the gains and you make money. That's fundamentally how markets work. To some degree, politics works that way, but not quite as well. But within a democratic political system, there is a kind of exchange that takes place of, I vote for you because you're going to do something good for me, and that disciplines leaders to do something that's on our behalf better than alternative systems. I don't want to overstate how well they do. It's not a perfect thing. So it's not so much about like trying to like make people better motivated, but trying to get systems in which the motivations that we have lead to better outcomes.
All right, our next question is from Gordon Miller. He's actually a former student of mine from Troy University and now getting a PhD in entrepreneurship at Baylor University. Congratulations on your recent basketball success, Gordon. He asks, given the explosion in the national debt in the last few years, are you optimistic at all about future spending habits of the USA, specifically in regards to spending intended to support the least fortunate among us? And what is your opinion of the efficiency of microlending?
Oh, that's a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't have anything particularly intelligent to say about microlending. I mean, I've read some of the papers on it that you, Gordon, have probably read, as since a person who's getting a PhD in this. And since it's not my research area, I don't have anything special to say about it. It looks like it is often pretty effective, in part because there's a sort of disciplinary thing. By the way, Amy Flatt, in case we don't get to you, I'm not missing that. I just want you to pay attention to the rest of the world and what it's like there. I'm doing all the adjustments, so I'm not understating poverty here. I think you're missing what poverty is elsewhere and how good it is to be poor here, despite everything you say. Everything you say is true, but it doesn't contradict what I say. So the thing that's nice about microlending is it disciplines people in a way that some kinds of charity don't, right? In a way, in order to get a loan, you have to say, like, I think I have a plan for turning the money that you give me into more money, which disciplines people to be kind of better. Something that I tend to like more than microlending, though, is something called unconditional zero overhead giving. So an example of this would be Give Directly. That's one of the charities that I tend to support. The way that Give Directly works is you just give them money and they'll go to a place that's quite poor, but they will look for people who are not begging. They're not asking for handouts. They're just leading their lives. And they'll just go up to them and they'll say, look, hey, you're poor. Here's $1,000. We're going to give this to you, no strings attached. We're not going to tell you how to spend it. You can do whatever you want with this money, but you need to know we're not coming back and giving you more. So the worry about it, because if you say to somebody like, hey, you're poor, here's $1,000. And if I come back next week and you're still poor, I'll give you another $1,000. That incentivizes some people to make bad choices on the margins. But so they don't do that. They just say, we're just gonna give you money and then we're going to walk away. And then what they do is they do come back, but they don't give them more money. They just see what they spend the money on. And what they find is that people who are productive, they spend the money on all sorts of things that make their lives a lot better, but not what the giver would have suspected. The idea here is like, you're poor, you're not stupid. If I give you the money, you'll do something good with it. But the important thing is that you just know it's not a multiple handout. It's just a one-time thing. You'll do something that genuinely benefits you. So from like one place where they did this, they found that like people end up putting metal roofs on their homes, and that reduced malaria and disease incidents by a tremendous amount. And no one in the West guessed that that's what they would have done, and that would have had that effect. I tend to think that's more effective than microloans. When I look at something like GiveWell, it seems like the evidence is that's stronger. So maybe for me, it's not so much are microloans a good thing, but are there better alternatives? I guess I'm willing to bet on that because I spend more money on GiveWell than on Give Directly than I do on microloans, but it's possible that I'm mistaken about that. As far as the question about spending, I'm not sure what to think about that. I mean, one reason is because macroeconomics is hard and it's kind of magical and not really clearly a science. But one of the worries I have a lot of friends who are saying the fact that we're spending this money is going to cause hyperinflation, right? Like all this money has been poured into like the economy that's going to cause massive amounts of inflation. And further, the debt has to be unsustainable. But if that's true, I wonder about two things. One is, why is the US government still able to get these loans at such a low interest rate, right? If Daniel was asking me for like $100,000 as a loan to him and I didn't think he could pay me back, I'm not going to give him like a 1% interest rate over 10 years. And sometimes with the federal bonds, you're getting negative yields. Like it's literally like the money will be worth less when you get it back than when you send it to them. So I don't understand. If you think markets are at all rational, it'd be puzzling why they're able to give out money this way. It's puzzling like how they'd be able to give out money this way and get money from people if they really are risky, because the people who are giving them money are placing a bet. They're putting their money where their mouth is. And similarly, if you think inflation is about to happen, you can get rich off of that, right? You can hedge your money against the US dollar. If you knew for a fact that the US dollar was going to have 10% inflation for the next 5 years, you can use that information to make yourself very rich by investing in certain things, moving your money into other money accounts and other kinds of things. And we don't see a lot of evidence of people doing that. I mean, wood's really expensive right now. It's probably a supply problem. So for that reason, the fact that markets are not in a way indicating that it's a problem makes me more skeptical that it was a problem than I would otherwise inclined to be. If it weren't for that, I might be like, oh, there's no way this is sustainable. But I don't know if people are still willing to lend the U.S. government money at such a low interest rate, then that's them saying that they don't think the government's going to default and it's going to be okay.
All right, our next question is from Nancy Staggs, and we have 12 more minutes, so keep your questions coming. If the rich are paying their fair share of taxes, why didn't anyone claim Warren Buffett's prize? I would think it'd be easy for someone to prove they're paying taxes at a higher rate than their personal assistant.
Yeah, I don't know, but I don't know much about the story about that. I hadn't heard that story before. Maybe it's because rich people have better things to do than to claim prizes, or it looks weird. But it's not like I'm coming up with like weird numbers. Like if I say like the US Congressional Budget Office and like every economics textbook and all these things, they're saying the same thing, that the taxes are predominantly paid by richer people in the US, and the typical person who's in like the top percent of income is like paying a lot more in taxes than the person below them. So I don't know why, but that doesn't make me doubt the story. It's just a weird little anecdote.
All right. Amy Flatt asks, is $7.25 minimum wage with union suppression abuse by the state?
Yeah, I mean, I guess union suppression is abuse by the state. If people want to band together and form a union, I think that they should be allowed to do so. I don't think they should be forced not to do so. As far as the minimum wage, you know, when I was in college, everyone left and right thought the minimum wage was a bad thing. It was like, obviously all that happens with the minimum wage is you just disemploy people. I have my own view of that, but I admit that it's a lot more controversial now than it used to be. Nevertheless, I think the evidence is still more on the side that the minimum wage is not a very effective way of making people well off. It's not clear that it really raises the income of workers. It leads to, I think, more discrimination against minorities and more discrimination in favor of white people. I think the disemployment effect is primarily borne by teenagers and others. I think if you're worried about poverty, there's much, even apart from that controversy, if you're worried about poverty, there are much more effective mechanisms for dealing with it, I think, than the minimum wage. You should advocate like a negative income tax, which is what like Milton Friedman, the free market economist, was defending. Have something like the earned income tax credit expanded so that, you know, if you're working, and even in some cases, if you're not working because you can't, the less you make, the more you get back from the government in a direct transfer, rather than demanding that it be paid by like an employer, in part because the employer won't be the one that really pays it. They'll end up passing it on to others, depending on the elasticity of various supply and demand. I shouldn't get into that stuff. I think there are more effective things than the minimum wage, and that's a negative income tax. If the poor are making too little money, instead of saying effectively, it's illegal to employ anyone whose labor is so non-productive that they produce less than $7.25 an hour. Just say some people, they're not very productive. Let's just tax and transfer. Why not just do that instead? I think that's a better system. I'm often surprised that like people on the left favor the minimum wage over direct transfers. It's a weird thing because I would think that they would go the other way. One of the arguments that people make is that the labor market is monopsonistic, and that explains why that there's wage compression. People are getting underpaid because there's so much power, but frankly, it's just not true. It's not borne out by the evidence. In fact, the market for unskilled labor is incredibly competitive in the economist sense of competitive, in part because everyone can use unskilled labor. It's just that unskilled labor isn't worth very much. It's not very productive. The markets for things like CEO pay, that's actually not very competitive. That's one of the cases where you get weird things happening when like the deviation from CEO pay to like the standard economic model is much higher. So I think instead of saying like, should we have the minimum wage laws increase? I'm like, let's just do something that is almost certainly going to be better. Just do negative income taxes.
All right. Well, Dr. Brennan, that's all the questions. No one else has asked anything else. So we really appreciate your time tonight. It's a fantastic lecture. And once again, Why It's Okay to Want to Be Rich, as well as all the other books I listed, you can look up. Jason has a webpage and everything like that available on Georgetown's website. And I'm sure he'd be thrilled to get any additional questions you may have via email. So thank you very much and have a good night.
All right, thank you very much. And Margaret, go ahead and email me that question and I'll send you an answer. Have a good one.
Bye.